So, over 40 years ago, there was an X-Men story that was so impactful, so well written, and unfortunately so accurate that it mirrored a time in our history that the writer felt it needed to be highlighted in order to learn from it for the greater good of our future and peace in society, so that hopefully we don't follow in the same footsteps of what was going on back then. But it looks like people just haven't really changed. God Loves, Man Kills is renowned to fans of comic books and especially fans of X-Men as one of the greatest comic book stories ever told. Look, I'm aware that not every person in certain categories are going to think the same or feel the same as others and each other. I know that the hatred isn't necessarily universal to a specific group, but sometimes it just kind of feels that way. And if you're turning a blind eye to it, or downright supporting people that support this kind of behavior, even though you feel like you don't support it but you're supporting others that support it, then yes, I would personally feel like you could still be considered part of the problem. And I know it's going to come off like I'm trying to force my way of thinking onto people or belittle them, which isn't the intention. The intention is to hopefully educate and hope that someone out there sees things in a different perspective and I don't know, maybe tap into their inner empathy that I know we all have the ability to possess. So the major theme of this specific X-Men comic book story is that people with mutant powers, genetic anomalies, they're being persecuted for being different. It's a representation of how over hundreds, maybe thousands of years, certain ethnic groups are marginalized, demonized, and discriminated against for being different. This story revolves around this awful character, Stryker, who's like a leader of a church cult, and he's using the name of God to essentially demonize mutants, and he goes about it in a way that eerily mirrors how politicians and world leaders go about their own prejudices. What I mean is Stryker created fear in the American people, fear of mutants. He knows that he alone can't go up against the mutants, and more specifically the X-Men, and he gets the mass population to see them as enemies. He spews bigotry and hate to make average Americans who are unhappy with their own lives blame the mutants for their own unhappiness. Which, come on, it's literally what's happening in America right now with the fight against immigrants. And it's been happening to the African American community for hundreds of years. It's been happening with discrimination towards Middle Eastern migrants as well. One of the points presented early on in this comic is how people will get called names and belittled, and it's easy for a third party or bystander to say, hey, just let it go, take the high road. But would it be so easy to say that if your heritage or, your type of people were the ones being insulted, like, would you still say it that way? Would you still want to take the high road? Like, in the story, I think it's at a bar, one of the characters gets verbally assaulted for hanging around mutants, and they throw a mutant-related, like, slur, and she's told by, I think it was Stevie, who's an African-American. Correct me if I'm wrong. I haven't read this in a while, but Stevie says, hey, let it go. Kitty Pryde then turns to Stevie, who, again, is African-American, and she tells her, well, would you feel the same way if they called me an N hard R lover instead? Like, if they insulted Kitty Pryde for being seen around an African American instead of like a mutant, and they called her an N-word lover instead of a mutie lover or mutant lover. And this is shown early on to point out that this very thing of people tend to think, oh, it's not going to happen to my people or to me personally, so it shouldn't be a big deal. One of the best examples of modern comparison are these Latinos for Trump sellouts who are then finding out, oh, they're targeting me too. Like, it's like, yeah, no shit. But just because you like their cult leader doesn't mean they want you in their cult. And, slowly but surely, lots of them f***ed around and found out, that just because it's not yet happening to you doesn't mean that it won't happen to you. The discrimination in the world may not happen to you yet, but it can. And so if you want someone to stand up for you when it happens, you should also stand up for them when it's happening to them, even if you don't know for sure that it's going to happen to you, if that makes sense. So a spoiler for the last half of this specific story, one of the most loyal followers of Stryker, who's like the main purifier that we follow, and the purifiers are like basically ice. So it turns out to be, she turns out to be a mutant, and she is unalived by Stryker without a second thought. It's like, it's like if the most successful ICE agent who, single-handedly captured dozens of migrants turned out to be illegal, and then, Trump immediately deports them after finding out. Another great portion of this comic is the debate between Charles Xavier, Professor X, and Stryker. And it felt eerily reminiscent of what politicians in general do. Stryker was clearly not trying to win over the people with facts and laws and reasonable statements. He was fear-mongering. Like, if you tune into Fox News and see how much fear-mongering they do against, the scary liberals or the scary trans people and, especially immigrants, of course the point is to inflict fear upon the American viewers, and that's literally what Stryker is doing here in 1984 or 82. He's making the average viewer fear mutants, and making the average American fear for their own children's lives, and how, if mutants are left unchecked, they will likely cause harm to, your way of life and your family. So while Charles was here trying to use logic and be reasonable, he kind of at the end of it looked like he lost the debate, which, I do have to point out how similar that is to, the last 10 years of Trump debates where he's just spewing crap that needs to, be constantly fact-checked, but his followers eat that up, pun intended.
They're eating the dogs.
And, I'm not strictly comparing just Trump to Stryker. It's politicians in general that use these tactics. Before I hear the Trump meat writers complain about other politicians, yeah, they're all the same. I don't care. I'm not pro-politicians. I'm not pro-political figures, on either side. I'm pro the people. Like I mentioned earlier, there's this group of people called the Purifiers in this story that feel similar to what ICE is doing now. These Purifiers are hunting down the mutants and rounding them up. And, you may never know when or where they might be because they're not, official, federal agents. They're not official cops, anything like that. And then it's not just comparable to ICE. These Purifiers are comparable to other groups out there and not just in America, but around the world that are doing morally questionable roundup of people or hunting down specific groups of people. And we get this part where Magneto and Wolverine capture some Purifiers, and while the X-Men don't do harm to people for information, in comes Magneto, who is normally in a villainous role, and in this case, he is siding with the X-Men, who are the good guys, to protect mutants. And so Magneto knows that the X-Men won't stoop to the level of these Purifiers, and Magneto is like, I bet, let me be the bad guy here. I don't care, someone needs to show them that people on this side of the fight are willing to get their hands dirty and have them taste their own medicine. And that's what I feel like the fighting class or the marginalized groups of people need right now. They need a Magneto in real life, like that is on the side of the oppressed, that is willing to fight back the oppressors, with their own game. The closest thing to the scenario that I've seen recently, and it's not even that close, it's like a little bit of a stretch, but there's some similarity, is the recent desperation from the Republican Party, specifically Trump, to redraw district maps to obtain more seats heading into the 2026 midterms. Although we definitely know that Trump is way too stupid to think of this on his own, so it's definitely like an overall GOP effort. And it's not like it's a new thing either. Like, this has happened many times before. But obviously, because it's Trump and he's calling up all the MAGA heavy states to redistrict, it's a huge deal to the left now. But regardless, we can agree that it's kind of scummy thing to do. I'm sure some people see it as, necessary, dumb political stuff and so on. And so the reason I say something similar is happening here to the mutants is that they're stooping down to the level of the Purifiers because the Democratic governor of California, Gavin Newsom, he has for a while now been attacking Trump and talking down to Trump the same way that Trump does to others. And, Donnie complains about it, whatever. And Newsom is now calling for a redistricting of California, which should balance out Democratic seats to the potential rise in GOP seats, that Dumpy is working so hard to get. And, of course, the grandpa old party is upset that a Democratic state is playing their games back and being as shady as they are. It's kind of funny that, the social media sites of Gavin Newsom are like pretty much trolling MAGA and posting the same kind of stuff that MAGA praises Trump for posting. But because it's Gavin Newsom, they're like losing their minds over it. At the end of the day, it's all really stupid American politics that I think most of America is sick of. But it's kind of funny to see the Democratic Party finally stooping down and playing a little bit dirty. So publicly like this, just how Republicans do. And I'm sure both parties are as shady and corrupt behind the scenes. So, before y'all try to say, oh, but the Democrats, wah, wah. Like, yes, I hate them too. I just at least can acknowledge that progressive ideologies are at least somewhat supported by the Democratic side compared to the GOP. But, anyway, back to the X-Men stuff. The rest of the story goes kind of how you would expect it to. The X-Men eventually, in the climax of it all, confront Stryker, who's, televising a Trump-style rally here. And I know it's a political rally regardless. We've had stuff like that before Trump, but Trump is synonymous with his little stupid rallies. So Stryker here, he's trying to use the captured Professor X to essentially bring to light other mutants in the area using Professor X's powers, and he's trying to force other mutants out and make them look bad. So then, the X-Men show up, and, they're thinking amongst each other, like, there's no reasoning with this guy. He's too far beyond logic, referring to Stryker. And, the best way to see, to settle things with him is essentially violence. But then Cyclops says, no, we're better than that. We need to debate him in front of his audience and make them see that the mutants are human. And Cyclops makes valid points. There's of course criminals amongst the mutants, but it's the same case with anyone. There are good and bad people amongst any label or specific groups of humans. It's up to everyone as a society to do what's best for each other, essentially, and not just pinpoint like, hey, this specific group is bad. But when we realistically know that there's good and bad people on every side. I mean, look at America. The people that are causing terrorism here in our country are not necessarily people of color, as much as Fox News and other media outlets would want you to believe. And so Stryker is seeing how, human and reasonable the X-Men are being, and he pulls out, the old pew pew, and he threatens to, pew pew Kitty Pryde, a harmless teenager, who's just standing there not harming anybody. And a police officer actually steps in and stops Stryker from pew-pewing Kitty Pryde. This police officer says that regardless of what side you're on, harming an innocent teenager that wasn't threatening Stryker was morally wrong, and ultimately Stryker defeats himself by showcasing to the world how deranged he is, in front of everybody. And yeah, I mean, I just think it's important to give this comic book a read, without too much context of prior X-Men or comic knowledge. This standalone story is great, and it can really be placed at any time period in history, and it feels relevant. At the end of the story or prologue, the message is basically that each extreme on both ends are dangerous, one way or the other. And at the end of the day, no matter what side you lean towards, the number one important fact is that discrimination is wrong, and that before we reach a point of violence, we need to reach a middle ground where both sides can peacefully coexist.